My parents told everyone I was the family failure. Then my brother was arrested on live TV. My brother was smiling into a television camera when 3 federal agents walked onto the stage and asked him to put his hands where they could see them. Behind him, a 12-foot screen displayed the slogan, "The Vail Family Builds Futures," while beneath it, a row of children held ceremonial silver shovels for the groundbreaking of a hospital wing that, as I already knew, did not exist anywhere except in renderings and donor brochures. My mother was seated in the front row wearing white, the color she always chose when she expected photographs. My father stood near the podium with one hand already lifted to begin the applause. Then, the lead agent turned Marcus away from the cameras, fastened cuffs around his wrists, and read charges that included wire fraud, conspiracy, theft from a charitable organization, and obstruction. The microphones caught every word. The broadcast cut to a wide shot, but not quickly enough to hide my mother's face. For 20 years, she had told anyone willing to listen that Marcus was the future of our family, and I was its one regrettable failure. Now, millions of people were watching her successful child being led away, and my phone was vibrating with a call from the prosecutor who knew I had helped explain where the missing money went. I watched from a conference room 3 blocks away with 2 forensic accountants, an attorney from the State Charity Bureau, and a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold before the broadcast began. Nobody in that room knew the full history behind the figures on our screens. To them, Vail Development was a complicated investigation involving shell vendors, inflated construction invoices, and a foundation whose public promises were larger than its bank balance. To me, it was the company whose logo had been stitched onto my father's jackets before I could read. It was the polished oak table where my parents had announced that Marcus would inherit leadership because he possessed instinct, charisma, and loyalty. It was also the same table where they had described my scholarship in accounting as a practical consolation prize for a daughter who lacked imagination. I had spent most of my adult life escaping that judgment. The strange part was that I did not feel triumphant when the handcuffs closed. I felt the weary recognition of someone watching a crack finally reach the surface after years of spreading behind a wall. In our family, success had never been measured by competence. It was measured by how well a person reflected my parents' preferred story. Marcus was 18 months older than I was, handsome in the effortless way that made strangers remember him, and gifted at turning an ordinary achievement into a family legend. When he scored a goal in a school match, my father spoke about it for years. When I won a statewide mathematics competition, my mother asked whether I could avoid mentioning the prize at dinner because Marcus had just been cut from a summer team. She called that protecting his confidence. By the time I was 12, I had learned that my accomplishments created discomfort, while his created unity. I became quiet, then useful, then nearly invisible. I balanced household bills when my father left folders open in his study. I caught duplicate payments at 16 and assumed adults would be pleased. Instead, my father laughed and told his friends that his little worrier had found 2 pennies out of place. The phrase, family failure, began as a joke, though only my parents found it funny. At 22, I declined an entry-level role at Vail Development and accepted a position with an audit firm in Chicago. My father had offered me a desk in accounts payable, reporting to a manager who reported to Marcus, even though Marcus had not finished his degree. He presented the offer as generosity. I asked whether there was a path into risk management or project finance. He said I was already making things complicated. When I chose the audit firm, my mother told relatives that I was too insecure for the family business and preferred hiding behind spreadsheets. At weddings and holiday parties, the description hardened. Marcus was building something. Lena checked other people's homework. Marcus understood people. Lena understood rules. Eventually, my mother began saying I had never found my place. My aunt softened it to late bloomer. My father was less delicate after his second drink. "Every family needs one failure," he said once, "because it keeps the successful children humble." I did not argue because arguments in our house were theater, staged for an audience whose verdict had already been written. I moved to Chicago with 2 suitcases, rented a narrow apartment above a bakery, and worked until numbers stopped looking like symbols and began looking like behavior. Forensic accounting suited me because fraud rarely appeared as one dramatic theft. It appeared as pressure, opportunity, and repeated small decisions disguised as exceptions. A vendor's address matched an employee's cousin. A contract was split into amounts just below an approval threshold. A manager insisted that missing records were proof of a disorganized office rather than a deliberate gap. I learned to follow what people minimized. Within 6 years, I had helped recover money for a pension fund, testified in a procurement case, and become the youngest director in my division. My parents attended none of the ceremonies. My mother did, however, forward me an article naming Marcus one of the city's 40 under 40, accompanied by the message, "This is what taking a risk looks like." Marcus returned to Vail Development after leaving college and acquired impressive titles at a pace no outside company would have allowed. Vice President at 24, Chief Strategy Officer at 27, President at 31. My father remained Chief Executive, but increasingly allowed Marcus to speak for the company. Marcus understood television and donors. He wore hard hats that had never touched dust, remembered the first names of reporters, and could describe luxury developments as acts of civic renewal. Under him, Vail expanded from commercial properties into public-private projects, schools, clinics, affordable housing, and municipal redevelopment. The work made our family wealthier and our name respectable. My parents treated every ribbon cutting as proof that their judgment about both children had been correct. I watched from a distance and noticed something they did not. Revenue grew quickly, but so did related party vendors. Projects were announced faster than permits were issued. The charitable foundation reported pledges as though they were cash. My first direct warning came from a woman named Priya Shah, who had been my closest friend during the one summer I worked in the family office. She had stayed and risen to controller. We had not spoken in almost a year when she called from her car and asked whether my firm handled confidential nonprofit reviews. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear traffic moving around her and understood she had left the office to speak safely. She described a payment queue filled with emergency invoices from newly formed companies. Several charged the Vail Futures Foundation for site preparation on the Children's Hospital wing. Yet the land named in the invoices was still owned by the county, and no transfer had been approved. Priya had raised the discrepancy with Marcus. He told her the foundation was prepaying trusted partners to preserve schedules. When she asked for contracts, her system access was reduced. I told Priya to preserve records lawfully, document every instruction, and speak with independent counsel. I also told her something harder. I could not privately investigate my family through my employer without conflict procedures. She sounded disappointed, although she said she understood. 2 weeks later, Vail announced that Priya had resigned for personal reasons. My mother called me that evening, not because she cared about Priya, but because she wanted me to congratulate Marcus on reorganizing a weak finance team. She explained that some people could not handle the speed of visionary leadership. I asked whether the foundation had acquired the hospital site. Silence settled between us, followed by the familiar chill in her voice. She wanted to know why I always searched for flaws in my brother's success. I answered that land ownership was not a flaw or an opinion. She ended the call after saying I had proved again why I could never belong inside the business. 3 months later, a package arrived at my office with no return address. Inside were photocopies of invoices, public property records, and a printed spreadsheet. The documents did not include confidential banking details, but they were enough to establish a pattern. 4 vendors shared a registered agent. 2 used virtual office addresses. Their invoices described different work in identical language, including the same misspelling of remediation. Payments were divided into amounts below the Foundation Board's secondary review threshold. At the bottom of the spreadsheet, someone had written, "Look at Northbridge Community Partners." I recognized the name. Northbridge was promoted as the Foundation's independent partner for neighborhood outreach, and Marcus regularly praised its founder, Julian Cross, on television. Public records showed that Northbridge had been incorporated by a lawyer who handled Marcus's personal real estate. Its listed office had once belonged to a marketing company run by Marcus's college roommate. None of that proved theft, but it was enough for me to prepare a conflict memorandum and notify my firm's general counsel. We did not open an investigation. Instead, counsel advised me to submit the public information through the State Charity Bureau's reporting channel and avoid accessing any family systems. I followed that advice exactly. I sent records, analysis, and a description of Priya's concerns without speculating beyond the evidence. Then I waited. For nearly 6 months, nothing visible happened. Vail held more galas. Marcus announced larger pledges. My parents gave an interview about raising a son who believed privilege created responsibility. In the same article, my mother mentioned that their daughter lived out of state and had chosen a quieter life. The investigation reached me through formal channels the following spring. A federal prosecutor and an investigator from the Charity Bureau requested an interview about my submission. They already had bank records obtained elsewhere and wanted help understanding the vendor relationships. Because of my family connection, every hour of my assistance was reviewed. I disclosed old employment, gifts, family trusts, and the fact that I owned a small, non-voting interest in Vale Development left by my grandmother. I refused payment and later accepted a narrowly defined consulting role through outside counsel. The precautions were frustrating but necessary. If the case ever became public, Marcus would claim I had engineered it from jealousy. My parents had spent years preparing people to believe exactly that. The bank records transformed suspicion into architecture. Money left the foundation as payments for soil testing, community engagement, temporary clinics, and architectural work. Within days, much of it moved through layered accounts and returned to entities connected to Marcus, Julian, and the company's chief operating officer, Graham Pike. Some paid the mortgage on a lake house held through a trust. Some funded political donations through employees who were reimbursed as bonuses. Nearly $2 million covered shortfalls at a luxury tower Marcus had championed after conventional lenders withdrew. The hospital project was not merely delayed. Donor money had been used to keep private investments alive, while public events created the impression of progress. Then, investigators found my name. A consulting agreement between Vale Futures and a company called Larkin Risk Advisory bore my signature. Larkin was my middle name, and the agreement described me as an independent compliance reviewer who had approved vendor controls. Attached reports used language lifted from articles I had published. The signature looked convincing until compared at high resolution, where repeated pen pressure revealed it had been assembled from scanned documents. There were also emails from an address resembling mine, with one letter transposed, instructing finance staff not to delay critical payments. The scheme had been designed with an escape route. If regulators arrived, Marcus could say his cautious, credentialed sister had reviewed everything. Seeing the forged signature affected me more than the stolen amount. Money could be traced. A forged identity invaded the life I had built precisely because my family had denied its value. Marcus had mocked my profession while borrowing its credibility. My parents had called me irrelevant while their favored son constructed a paper version of me to stand between him and prison. I stared at the agreement until the letters blurred, then asked the investigator to document every source from which Marcus might have obtained my signature. Old shareholder consents, holiday trust documents, and the employment paperwork from my college summer were all held at Vale. Access logs showed that Graham had downloaded archived personnel files shortly before Larkin Risk was formed. I was instructed not to contact my family about the forgery. That became increasingly difficult as my parents pulled me toward the hospital campaign. My mother invited me to the groundbreaking and said attendance might finally show that I supported something beyond rules. My father asked me to appear in the family row because donors liked continuity. Marcus called twice, unusually warm, and said it was time to stop competing. He offered to announce that I would serve on the foundation's audit committee. The timing was not affectionate. Investigators believed he wanted a real photograph and public record connecting me to oversight before the next financial report. I declined by saying I had an existing engagement. Marcus laughed softly and told me I would regret missing the biggest day in our family's history. It became the biggest day, although not as he intended. Authorities planned the arrest after a sealed indictment and coordinated it to prevent the deletion of evidence. The live broadcast was not chosen for spectacle. It was simply where Marcus would be, while search teams entered offices and homes. Still, the symbolism was impossible to miss. He had arranged children, donors, politicians, and cameras as props in a story about generosity. The same cameras recorded the moment that story collapsed. When agents moved toward him, Marcus first assumed they were security. He kept smiling. Only when one agent took his wrist did his face change. My father stepped forward and was told to remain where he was. My mother stood so abruptly that her chair struck the woman behind her. Julian disappeared from the side of the stage, but officers arrested him in the parking garage. Within 12 minutes, my parents called me 11 times. I did not answer until the prosecutor released me from the conference room. My father spoke first when I finally picked up. He did not ask whether I was safe or whether I knew what had happened. He ordered me to use my professional contacts to fix a misunderstanding. In the background, my mother was crying and saying the arrest had been staged by political enemies. I said Marcus had counsel and should follow counsel's advice. My father demanded that I come home. When I refused to discuss details, his voice sharpened. He accused me of sounding pleased. The old script arrived with astonishing speed. I had always resented Marcus. I had waited for him to stumble. I did not understand loyalty. I listened until he called the charges paperwork invented by failed people who hated builders. Then I told him I would not obstruct an investigation and ended the call. By evening, reporters had identified me. Some repeated the family biography from old society profiles, calling me the estranged accountant's sister. Others found conference videos and described me as a fraud specialist. A photograph of me leaving a courthouse years earlier was placed beside the image of Marcus in cuffs, inviting strangers to invent a rivalry. My mother's friends posted that our family needed privacy. Marcus's publicist issued a statement calling the charges baseless and emphasizing that all foundation expenditures had undergone independent review. The statement did not name me, but it used the exact title from the forged agreement. That confirmed the defense strategy before Marcus had even spent a night in custody. My parents held a press conference the next afternoon outside Vail headquarters. My father declared absolute faith in his son. My mother described Marcus as a humanitarian attacked on the day he was trying to help sick children. Then a reporter asked about me. My mother paused long enough to make the answer seem reluctant. She said I had been distant from the family for years, had struggled to celebrate my brother's achievements, and might possess information taken out of context. It was a careful, public version of family failure. She did not accuse me directly. She simply arranged the familiar pieces so the audience would reach the desired conclusion. I watched the clip once and sent it to my attorney. Anger would have been easier if I had expected better. Instead, I felt something colder. Confirmation that my parents would sacrifice me before asking whether Marcus had sacrificed thousands of donors. My attorney issued a brief statement saying I had no role in the foundation's management and would cooperate with lawful inquiries. We did not mention the forged records because the indictment remained partially sealed. Silence made me look vulnerable, but it protected the case. For the next month, I allowed people to misunderstand me, while investigators traced the false email account, recovered deleted drafts, and interviewed employees who had been told that Lena approved it. Priya became the most important witness. After leaving Vail, she had preserved a chronological memo, copies of public-facing documents, and messages she was legally entitled to retain. She described a meeting where Marcus instructed staff to route questions through Larkin Risk. When Priya asked to meet the consultant, Graham said my schedule was confidential because of family tensions. Later, Marcus told her that I preferred remote work because I was embarrassed about my career. The cruelty of that lie was almost elegant. He used my parents' established contempt to explain why nobody could speak with the imaginary compliance officer. People believed it because they had heard versions of it at company dinners for years. At Marcus's detention hearing, prosecutors revealed the forged consulting arrangement and stated that a close relative's identity had been used. News outlets connected the clues within an hour. My parents arrived at my apartment that night without warning. It was the first time they had visited in 7 years. My mother looked around the modest but carefully restored rooms as though searching for evidence that I had suffered. My father refused to sit. He said the signature issue could be explained as administrative convenience. According to him, Marcus had needed a compliance structure quickly, and since I was family, using my background had harmed no one. I asked whether he understood that the documents could have made me criminally liable. He answered that charges against me would never have gone anywhere because they knew I was not important enough to design the scheme. The sentence settled over us. Even while asking me to save Marcus, my father still needed me to remain small. My mother interrupted, saying he had expressed himself badly. She explained that Marcus was under unbearable pressure protecting employees, investors, and the family name. She wanted me to say publicly that I had informally advised the foundation, which would make the consulting agreement appear less fraudulent. In return, the family would cover my legal fees and welcome me back. I asked whether they wanted me to commit a crime on camera. My mother began to cry in earnest then, not from confusion, but because I had named the request plainly. She said families sometimes absorbed imperfect choices for one another. I brought out a folder I had kept since my first year in Chicago. Inside were newspaper clippings my mother had mailed, invitations placing Marcus's title in gold, and one birthday card from my father telling me not to become bitter about ordinary work. I did not show it to punish them. I needed them to understand that their current appeal to family rested on years when family had been offered to me only as obedience. I told them I would tell the truth under oath and nowhere else. My father called that revenge. I answered that revenge would require me to invent consequences. Marcus had created these himself. They left after my mother said I would be alone when the attention ended. For the first time, the threat did not frighten me. Vail development began to unravel. Banks froze credit lines tied to representations in foundation partnership agreements. Municipalities paused contracts. Subcontractors demanded payment, and employees learned that retirement contributions had been delayed while executive bonuses cleared on schedule. My father insisted the company was fundamentally strong, but investigators showed me internal cash forecasts, proving it had depended on constant transfers between restricted and unrestricted accounts. Marcus had not stolen from a healthy empire. He had kept a weakening one alive with each new announcement, using reputation to generate money that covered the previous promise. The hospital wing was the largest and last layer. The discovery forced me into a conflict I had tried to avoid. My grandmother's non-voting shares gave me standing to receive certain notices, and independent directors asked whether I would join a restructuring committee. Accepting could help protect employees and legitimate projects, but it would also confirm my parents' claim that I wanted control. I consulted ethics counsel and the prosecution team. They established strict boundaries. I would not access criminal evidence through the company, influence witnesses, or participate in decisions involving defense costs. With those limits, I agreed. I did not do it for the Vale name. I did it because 800 employees should not lose livelihoods to preserve one man's mythology. The first board meeting after the arrest took place at the same oak table where I had once been offered accounts payable. My father sat at the head, despite having been temporarily stripped of executive authority. He looked older, but his anger remained vigorous. 2 independent directors, a restructuring officer, outside counsel, and I reviewed the cash crisis. When I explained that 3 projects needed immediate ring fencing to prevent restricted funds from being swept by lenders, my father interrupted to say I was enjoying myself. Nobody supported him. The restructuring officer asked me to continue. It was a small procedural moment, yet it changed the room. My expertise no longer required my father's permission to exist. We found that Marcus had surrounded himself with people rewarded for movement rather than completion. Announcements triggered bonuses. Signed letters of intent were treated like funded contracts. Objections were relabeled negativity, and employees who raised them were isolated. The culture resembled my childhood at institutional scale. Good news belonged to Marcus. Bad news belonged to whoever noticed it. My parents had not merely favored a child, they had exported that favoritism into governance. My father's board reports omitted risks because he believed confidence attracted solutions. My mother chaired the foundation's donor committee and treated questions as personal disloyalty. Neither appeared to have taken money, but both had made theft easier by punishing reality. As the criminal case moved toward trial, Marcus offered to plead guilty to reduced tax and reporting charges if prosecutors dropped the fraud conspiracy and publicly cleared the family. The offer failed because evidence showed deliberate planning. Recovered messages between Marcus and Graham discussed the sister shield. In one, Marcus wrote that nobody would question compliance bearing my name because I was painfully honest. In another, Graham joked that if things collapsed, my bitterness would make motive easy to sell. Marcus responded with a laughing symbol and said my parents had spent years building that file for them. Reading those messages in a secure room ended something inside me. Until then, a small part of me had wondered whether Marcus had used my identity in panic. The messages proved he had selected me because he understood exactly how our family had positioned me. The prosecution warned that the defense might attack my character. They were right. Marcus's lawyers argued that I had fed investigators a biased interpretation because I wanted recognition and control of Vale. They subpoenaed personal messages, employment reviews, and therapy records, though the court limited much of the request. At trial, they displayed an old family photograph in which I stood apart from Marcus and my parents. The attorney asked whether I had always considered myself excluded. I said exclusion was not accounting evidence. He asked whether I resented my brother. I answered that feelings did not create bank transfers, forged signatures, or false vendors. Each attempt to turn the case into a sibling drama collapsed against records that did not care whom our parents loved more. My testimony lasted 2 days. I explained approval thresholds, vendor clustering, account flows, metadata, and the methods used to assemble my signature. I avoided theatrical language. The jury did not need a story about a cruel family. It needed a clear path through deliberate acts. On cross-examination, Marcus's attorney suggested I had informally allowed him to cite my credentials. I asked him to show a message, contract, calendar entry, or witness proving consent. He could not. He then asked why Marcus would choose my identity if he believed I was a failure. The courtroom became very still. I said that was precisely why he chose it. My family mocked the work publicly, but trusted its credibility privately, and they believed I would be too isolated to defend myself. My mother left the courtroom before I finished. My father stayed, staring at the table. Marcus looked at me only once. There was no apology in his expression, only disbelief that the version of me he had relied upon was no longer cooperating. I realized he had never thought of me as weak. Weakness would not have made a useful shield. He had known I was competent, ethical, and careful. He simply believed those qualities could be exploited because our parents had trained me to accept mistreatment quietly. That understanding hurt more than contempt, but it also freed me. I had spent years trying to prove my worth to people who already knew it and found denial more convenient. Graham testified under a cooperation agreement. He described how the scheme began with one temporary transfer intended to be repaid after a luxury project refinanced. When refinancing failed, Marcus authorized false foundation invoices. New donations covered old gaps. Julian created vendors and moved money. Graham built the false compliance trail. My father received optimistic summaries and asked few questions. My mother pressured donor staff to keep announcements ahead of fundraising targets. According to Graham, Marcus believed the family's reputation made scrutiny unlikely. If questions arose, he planned to blame rogue vendors, then Graham, and finally me. Every person around him was both tool and future scapegoat. The jury convicted Marcus on 11 counts. He remained still as the verdicts were read, but my father bent forward as if struck. Outside, reporters asked whether I felt vindicated. I said the verdict belonged to the evidence, and that the priority should be compensating the foundation and completing viable community projects. It was not the answer they wanted, yet it was true. Vindication suggested something restored to its former condition. I did not want my former condition. I wanted a life in which my value was not measured against Marcus at all. Sentencing exposed the human scale hidden by financial language. A pediatric clinic had postponed an expansion after a promised grant vanished. A housing nonprofit had hired staff for a project Vail never funded. Small donors had contributed memorial gifts, believing the hospital wing was secured. Employees had lost retirement matches. Priya spoke about being professionally smeared after she questioned invoices. I submitted a statement about identity misuse, but did not request a particular sentence. Marcus received 9 years in federal prison and an order of restitution far beyond his remaining assets. Julian and Graham received lesser sentences. The court also barred Marcus from serving as an officer of a charity or public contractor after release. My parents' response evolved in stages. First came denial, then rage at the cooperating witnesses, then bargaining with public opinion. My mother gave one interview claiming Marcus had loved too deeply and trusted the wrong people. The backlash was immediate because the documents showed he had directed them. My father stopped speaking to the press. When the company formally removed him as chief executive for governance failures, he blamed me in a letter to shareholders. The independent board released meeting minutes proving the decision had passed without my vote because I had recused myself. Even his accusation became evidence of the habit that had damaged Vail. Accountability was always an attack delivered by someone inferior. Restructuring took 18 months. We sold the lake house, 2 aircraft interests, undeveloped luxury parcels, and naming rights Marcus had purchased for himself with company money. Executive bonuses were clawed back. Viable construction projects were transferred into a new operating company with independent oversight. The foundation was separated permanently from Vale and placed under a board that included nonprofit leaders, medical administrators, donor representatives, and no member of my family. The hospital wing could not proceed as advertised, but recovered assets funded a smaller pediatric outpatient center on land the county actually owned. Priya accepted the role of chief financial officer at the reorganized company only after insisting on whistleblower protections and direct access to the audit committee. I declined the chief executive position when it was offered. That surprised everyone, especially my parents. My father had decided that my involvement proved I had wanted his chair all along. Walking away denied him that explanation, but I did not do it for him. I had built a career I respected, and saving Vale did not obligate me to spend my future inside it. I agreed to serve one final year as an independent director and then relinquished the seat. My grandmother's shares were converted during restructuring, and I directed part of the proceeds into an employee hardship fund. I kept the rest. Recovery did not require self-erasure. My mother asked to meet shortly before the outpatient center opened. We chose a quiet restaurant because neither of us wanted the old family house to control the conversation. She had stopped wearing white. Without cameras and committees, she looked smaller and less certain. She said she had been reviewing old photographs and school programs, noticing how often my achievements appeared without either parent present. She admitted that praising Marcus had become a way to justify every sacrifice made for him. Once they had invested their identity in his success, any evidence of my competence felt like an accusation. It was the closest she had come to explaining rather than defending. She apologized, but the apology arrived tangled with requests. She wanted me to visit Marcus, help my father through depression, and consider restoring the family name by taking leadership of Vale. I told her remorse could not be another method of assigning me work. If she regretted abandoning me, she could begin by knowing me without asking me to repair the people who benefited. She cried quietly. I did not rescue her from the discomfort. Before leaving, she said she had never truly believed I was a failure. I answered that saying it for 20 years had produced the same result. Intent did not refund consequences. My father took longer. Nearly a year passed before he wrote a letter without copying an attorney. He described the company he had started with 1 truck and 2 employees and how terrified he had been of losing it. Marcus's confidence had soothed that fear, while my questions intensified it. He had treated reassurance as leadership and caution as weakness. He admitted authorizing foundation transfers without reading the underlying reports because Marcus promised repayment. Though prosecutors found insufficient evidence that my father knew the money was stolen, he finally acknowledged that chosen ignorance was not innocence. At the end, he wrote that he was proud of me. I read the sentence several times and felt almost nothing. Pride, offered after public proof, was not the nourishment it might have been when I was 12. I responded with boundaries rather than forgiveness. We could meet occasionally. He could not discuss Marcus's appeal, ask me for money, or blame employees and regulators. If he insulted my work or rewrote the past, I would leave. Our first meeting lasted 23 minutes. The second lasted nearly an hour. Progress was neither dramatic nor guaranteed. I stopped judging myself by whether I could transform my parents into people they had never practiced being. Their growth belonged to them. The outpatient center opened on a rainy Tuesday without a televised gala. There were no celebrity donors, silver shovels, or giant portraits of Marcus. Nurses led small groups through examination rooms painted in calm colors. A plaque near the entrance listed recovered donor funds and community partners, not the Vale family. Priya stood beside me as the first families arrived. She said the building was smaller than the promise, but more honest. That sentence captured everything the last 3 years had taught me. A real clinic with modest walls mattered more than a spectacular rendering designed to protect an image. After the opening, a young reporter asked whether I considered myself the successful sibling now. The question sounded harmless, but it preserved the same contest that had trapped us. I told her success was not a chair Marcus had vacated when agents led him away. His arrest did not promote me. My career had been real before the cameras noticed, and his crimes did not create my value. The article used only part of the quote, yet enough remained that strangers began sending messages about being designated the disappointing child in their own families. Many believed they needed a dramatic reversal to prove everyone wrong. I wished I could tell each of them that a reversal was not required. For years, I had fantasized about one undeniable achievement, forcing my parents to revise their story. Then, the undeniable moment arrived in the worst possible form, and I understood the flaw in that fantasy. People committed to misunderstanding you can reinterpret anything. My parents saw promotions as loneliness, independence as bitterness, and evidence as betrayal. If I had waited for their verdict to change, I would have spent my entire life arguing before a court that did not recognize facts. Freedom began when I stopped appealing. Marcus wrote from prison 6 months after sentencing. His letter filled 12 pages. He apologized for using my signature, but spent more space describing pressure from lenders, expectations from our father, and his belief that he could repay the foundation before anyone was harmed. He said the live arrest replayed in his mind and asked whether I had known the exact moment agents would arrive. Beneath the question was a final attempt to make me the author of his humiliation. I answered in 3 paragraphs. I said I had not selected the time, the cameras, or the charges. I said repayment plans did not turn theft into borrowing when donors were deceived. Finally, I said any future relationship required him to describe his decisions without placing me, our parents, or pressure in the grammatical position of cause. He did not write again for almost a year. When he did, the letter was shorter. He said, "I forged your name because I thought your honesty belonged to the family and therefore to me." It was the first fully accountable sentence I had ever received from him. I did not mistake it for transformation, but I preserved it. Accountability, like fraud, often begins with a small pattern. One honest sentence could not repair thousands of dishonest ones. It could only be the next entry in a record whose future remained undecided. I returned to my firm and eventually became a partner leading public interest investigations. I also began teaching a seminar on organizational denial. I never used my family's names, though the lessons were present in every lecture. Fraud grows where questions carry social penalties. Governance fails when loyalty is defined as agreement. Charismatic leaders become dangerous when institutions treat discomfort as proof that the messenger is defective. Students sometimes expected technical tricks for catching criminals. I taught them to notice the room, who gets interrupted, whose optimism is rewarded, whose warnings are called personal, and which person has been selected to absorb failure before it occurs. On the 4th anniversary of Marcus's arrest, the clip resurfaced online. I saw the familiar stage, the bright slogan, my mother's white dress, and my brother's smile disappearing as the first cuff closed. This time I did not watch to the end. I closed the screen and walked to a dinner with people who knew me without comparing me to anyone. Priya was there, along with colleagues, neighbors, and my partner Daniel, who had never once described my work as hiding behind numbers. Nobody toasted my victory over Marcus. We talked about ordinary things: a leaking roof, a difficult client, a niece learning to drive, the outpatient center's new vaccination program. That ordinary dinner felt more meaningful than any public vindication. My parents had taught me that family identity was a ranking, that love followed performance, and that the designated failure should remain available to protect the designated star. The investigation broke the financial scheme, but refusing that role broke something older. Marcus was arrested on live television because of crimes he chose to commit. I was not transformed by the moment, promoted by it, or finally made worthy through his fall. I had been worthy in the apartment above the bakery, in the audit rooms nobody photographed, in every quiet decision to tell the truth when a more celebrated person wanted comfort instead. People still occasionally recognize my last name and ask what it was like watching my brother taken away. They expect satisfaction or heartbreak. The truth contains both and neither. I grieved the brother he might have been, the parents I had needed, the employees and donors used as scenery, and the years I spent trying to win a fair hearing from an unfair family. But I also gained the one inheritance my parents never intended to give me: the certainty that their story about me was only a story. It had been repeated at enough tables to sound like fact. Then facts arrived: bank records, forged signatures, recovered messages, completed work, and the story could no longer carry the weight placed upon it. One of the former foundation employees later told me how the family legend had looked from outside. On her first day, a manager warned her never to copy me on routine questions because I was jealous of Marcus and likely to slow projects out of spite. She had never met me, yet she had absorbed an opinion about my character as part of her job orientation. Months later, when she noticed duplicate outreach invoices, she stayed silent because raising the issue might make her resemble the difficult sister everyone mocked. Her admission showed me that private favoritism does not remain private when powerful people carry it into institutions. It becomes procedure. It teaches strangers which facts are safe to ignore and which person can be blamed without investigation. My parents' dinner table joke had traveled into payroll decisions, compliance gaps, and finally, a federal courtroom. That was why I resisted suggestions that the scandal could be resolved by a family reconciliation photograph. A crisis consultant proposed an interview in which my parents and I would sit together, acknowledge mistakes, and announce a new era of transparency. The image might have helped lenders, but it would also have converted accountability into another performance. I recommended that Vail publish audited project data, repayment schedules, whistleblower statistics, and board attendance records instead. Trust should return through verifiable conduct, not the arrangement of relatives on a sofa. The board agreed. For the first time, our public message contained fewer adjectives than numbers. The change produced no instant redemption. Some contracts were lost forever. Donors refused to return. Former employees sued, and several claims were justified. My parents sold the house where Marcus and I had grown up to satisfy restitution and personal guarantees. My mother mourned the dining room as if the walls had created our family, while I remembered how many judgments had been issued there between dessert and coffee. When they moved into a smaller condominium, I helped label boxes, but did not take responsibility for their grief. Consequences were not cruelty merely because they were uncomfortable. They were the accurate shape of choices finally occupying space. In one box, I found the certificate from my mathematics competition, still sealed in the envelope the school had mailed. My mother stared at it for a long time. She said she must have forgotten to frame it. I told her forgetting was possible once. A pattern required participation. Then I took the certificate home, not because I needed proof of being exceptional at 12, but because the girl who had earned it deserved one adult willing to keep it. I framed it above my desk beside nothing related to Marcus. That small act gave me more peace than watching any verdict. The last time my mother introduced me to someone, she did not call me Marcus's sister or mention that I had helped save the company. She said, "This is my daughter, Lena. She is a forensic accountant." The words were simple and years late. I accepted them without turning them into absolution. Later, as I left, I passed the framed magazine cover that had once named Marcus a visionary. My parents had removed it from the center of the hall, but had not thrown it away. I understood. Families rarely erase their myths in one brave act. They move them gradually, from the wall to a drawer, from certainty to shame, from destiny to evidence. My own evidence no longer needed their house. It lived in the career I chose, the people I protected, the boundaries I kept, and the quiet life I built after the cameras turned elsewhere. For most of my childhood, my parents told everyone I was the family failure. When my brother was arrested on live television, the world expected the title to pass from me to him. I refused it. A family can learn from failure, conceal failure, or manufacture a person to carry it, but failure is not a child. It is a result. And for the first time in our lives, the people who created the result had to carry their own names.